Hello, it's teacher Adrian again, and we are here for our last video of a series of videos of Grade Time 5, Unit 6. And this video, we're going to work with grammar, linkers of contrast. Let me show you something. Here we have two sentences, okay? We have sentence number 1. The weather is bad. So it's a negative idea, isn't it? It shows a negative idea. Sentence number 2, I love London. It's a positive idea. So the weather, I love London. The weather in London is bad. So the first one, I love London, is positive, and the weather in London is bad is a negative idea. How can we join these two sentences? What word I can put to join these two sentences in only one sentence? We have some words that we can use. Let's see. One of the words is although. So how can we use although to join a negative idea and a positive idea? Let's take a look. Although the weather is bad, I love London. So here, I used although at the beginning of the first sentence, and then I put I love London at the end. So here we have two clauses, as we say, two sentences. A clause is a sentence with a verb. Okay? So, although the weather is bad, I love London. And this presents a contrast, okay, between a positive idea and a negative idea, or in this case, first a negative idea and a positive idea. Can I invert? Yes, I can. Look, I love London, although the weather is bad. So it's the same thing, but I inverted the clauses, okay? The only difference is that in this one here, when I start with the although, which is the linker of contrast, I put a comma here. Although the weather is bad, comma, I love London. I love London, although the weather is bad. There is no comma, okay? Let's see another one. The weather is bad, a negative idea, and I love London. And I can use even though, which is pretty much the same as although. So it's pretty much the same. Even though the weather is bad, I love London. Or, I love London even though the weather is bad. Okay? So both even though and although, it's the same, okay? They use the same pattern, the same structure. Okay? Now let's move on to another one. The weather is bad, the negative idea, and I love London, a positive idea. If I want to use despite, there is a little bit of difference between despite and although. Here I use despite the weather, or despite the bad weather, I love London. What is the difference? When I use although, I have to use a clause with a verb. Yes, so although the weather is bad, I love London. Here I use just as we call it in English, a noun phrase. Okay, I'm just using the weather. I don't need to use the verb. So here I say, despite the weather, or despite the bad weather, I love London. Or, I love London despite the weather, or despite the bad weather. So I can invert as well, but in the first case, letter A, I need to use a comma. Alright? Here, I have another possibility with despite. So with the word despite, okay, I can use with gerund as well. So I can say, despite the weather being bad, I love London. So the first one was despite the bad weather, I love London. Here it's another way to say, despite the weather being bad, I love London. So here I use being in the gerund. Or, I love London despite the weather being bad. So it's the same thing, I just inverted the two sentences or the two clauses. Okay. Now let's see with in spite of. The same thing of despite. I can use in spite of the bad weather, I love London, or I love London in spite of the bad weather. Here I don't use a verb. I just use a noun phrase. Okay. And I can use a gerund as well with in spite of. I can say, in spite of the weather being bad, I love London, and I love London in spite of the weather being bad. Okay? So it's a little bit different from although or even though. Because even though, I need to use a clause, a verb. And finally, we have the weather is bad, I love London. I can use however. However is a little bit different. However, I make two separate sentences with however, like this. I love London, period. So this is a sentence. However, comma, the weather is bad. So here I don't put the two sentences together. I separate them. One sentence, and then the next sentence I begin with however. So, however, introduces a contrasting idea and come at the beginning of a new sentence, okay? So that's the difference. And the same happens with nevertheless. Nevertheless and however are similar. I love London. Nevertheless, the weather is bad. So introduces a contrasting idea and comes at the beginning of a new sentence. Okay? So let's take a look. Here we have other examples with explanations, okay? So the linkers although and even though are followed by a clause. They can be used at the beginning of a sentence or before the second sentence. But what it's important here is that they are followed by a clause. A clause is a sentence with a verb. So I passed my driving test, although or even though I made some mistakes. So here it's followed by the clause I made some mistakes. And I can invert. Although or even though I made some mistakes, comma, I passed my driving test. So when I start with although or even though, I have to use a comma after the first clause. Okay? Number 2. The linkers despite and in spite of are followed by a noun phrase or a gerund. They can be used at the beginning of a sentence or before the second clause. For example, I passed my driving test despite or in spite of some mistakes. So some mistakes is a noun phrase. Okay? But I can also use a gerund in spite of making or despite making some mistakes. And I can invert as well. Despite some mistakes or despite making some mistakes, I passed my driving test. And finally, number 3, the linkers however and nevertheless come at the beginning of a sentence and introduce a contrast with what was said in the previous sentence. So here we have two different sentences, okay? They're not together. I made some mistakes on my driving test, period. Another sentence. However, or nevertheless, comma, I passed. Okay? So these are the rules for those linkers of contrast. So now let's try to make the rule, right? So to contrast ideas and facts, we use the linking words although, even though, however, despite, in spite of, and nevertheless. Despite and in spite of are followed by a noun phrase or a gerund. They can be used at the beginning or in the middle of a sentence, okay? Although and even though are followed by a full clause, by a sentence with a verb, okay, and a complement. They can be used at the beginning or in the middle of a sentence. And finally, however and nevertheless introduce the contrasting idea and come at the beginning of a new sentence. So here we have two sentences. They are followed by a comma. All right? Is that clear? Now, we are going to go to the activity number 2 in your books. Let's see. So here in this activity number 2, you have to rewrite the sentences using the word in parentheses. Okay, let's take a look at the example 0. I didn't know anyone at the party, but I still had a good time. So we have two contrasting ideas here. So a positive and a negative. The negative is, I didn't know anyone at the party. The positive, I still had a good time. So how can I put these two sentences together? In spite of not knowing anyone at the party, I still had a good time. In spite of, negative, and the gerund, knowing anyone. Okay? So now I would like you to pause this video and try to put these two sentences together in number 1 up to number 6. Okay? See you in a minute. Bye. Okay, so how was it? Let's try to correct it. See if you did it right, if you got it right. So, number 1, I studied hard for the test. But, negative, I failed it. So how can I put these two sentences together using despite? So one possibility is despite, so despite studying. So here we have to use, because we have the verb study. So we have to use the gerund with despite. So despite studying hard for the test, I failed it. Okay? Despite studying hard for the test, I failed it. He doesn't earn a lot of money. He gives a lot to charity. So this is the negative and this is the positive. So we have to use the word however. So he doesn't earn a lot of money. However, so however, comma, he gives a lot to charity. Okay, so that's simple. Number 3, I'd seen the movie before. I still really enjoyed it. Okay, so although, we have to start with although. Although, sorry, let's see. Although, so although what? I'd seen. Although I'd seen the movie before, I still really enjoyed it. So here it's a full clause, right? Although I had seen the movie. That's okay. Number 4, I started to eat less. I didn't lose any weight. So two contrasting ideas here. So I didn't lose any weight in spite of, here we have to use the gerund. In spite of, yeah, got it. And now. So what's the word here? Start. What's the verb here? Start. So I didn't lose any weight in spite of starting to eat less. Okay? Here, so here I have to get the verb and put it in the gerund. I didn't lose any weight in spite of starting to eat less. It wasn't very warm. We had a good time at the beach. It wasn't very warm. Nevertheless, comma, we had a good time at the beach. Okay. I don't speak a word of Chinese. I understood what he said. So even though what he said, so even though I understood what he said, even though I don't speak a word of Chinese. I understood what he said, even though I don't speak a word of Chinese. Let's check. Okay, very good. So did you get it right? So here you have to know, we have although and even though, then they're followed by a clause, a full clause with a subject and a verb. Despite and in spite of, it's followed by a noun phrase or gerund, the verb with ing. And however and nevertheless, there are two sentences. The first sentence and then the next sentence starts with however and nevertheless. Okay? I hope you got it. So thank you. And that's the last video of this unit. So see you in the next unit. Bye bye.